This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. If you recall, last week we had Michael Flores with us. He spoke about financing cannabis businesses in New York State. Now I'm going to talk about cannabis in the workplace. Cannabis in the workplace under New York State Labor Law 201D. The first question I'm going to ask: can an employer force an employee to be tested for the cannabis use? Well, no, because these tests do not demonstrate impairment. Labor Law 201 says that the employee can seek testing. However, unless the federal or state law requires that drug testing is mandatory for a particular position, you cannot require an employee to be tested for cannabis use. But as an example of what federal and state law does prohibit are drivers of commercial vehicles under federal and state law. Now, what New York State law governs the use of marijuana in the workplace? It is the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, also called MRTA. MRTA makes marijuana a legal consumable product. Well, next question is, where and when can an employee use marijuana? Can he use it in his office? No. He can use it outside of work hours without the use of the employer's premises or equipment. Now let's talk about remote work. Remote work has become very prevalent these days, what with the world of COVID. You must keep in mind that you should not use cannabis while using company equipment, and you should not use it during work hours. Well, when else can an employer prohibit the use of marijuana? Well, when there is a federal or state law prohibiting the use, and when an employer would lose a federal contract or federal funding. So the next question is, what protections do employers have? When an employee, when working, shows demonstrable symptoms of its use that impairs is important, or decreases his level of performance on the tasks that then he can be terminated. But it has to be clear that he's impaired. His level of performance is impaired or decreased from normal. If a person appears to be affected, he does not have protection unless he has a known or unknown, it's a key word, to the employer disability. Disability is key. Now, what are symptoms of cannabis use that might affect his level of competency on the job? Well, not showing up on time, neglecting hygiene, loud talking and laughter, irritability, reduced activity, defensiveness, secretiveness, low energy, self-centeredness, and green tar stains on his clothing or her clothing. The use of air fresheners, trouble performing usual tasks, can show cannabis impairment with an employer's obligation to provide a safe and a healthy workplace under federal and state laws. Well, what are some examples of a safe workplace? For instance, operating heavy machinery. So you could ask, can I go to work smelling of cannabis? Well, I would say don't do it, because it's like raising a red flag before a bull. Don't consume it just before going to work. The smell does not indicate the employee is impaired, nor that his level of performance is reduced. to an inadequate level. The question is his or her work done well or inadequately? Don't raise a red flag that gets an employer documenting you, documenting whatever is going on. Disciplinary actions can be taken if an employee is using cannabis during work hours or while using employee property, because that's not part of his work description. Now let's talk about, well, can he use cannabis during meals or break periods? No, a person cannot consume cannabis during these work hours. Even if the child or person, or should say the person leaves the work site, cannot use cannabis because it's during work hours. Now, what are considered to be work hours? A meal break, break times, on-call, times you're expected to be at work. So, cannabis possession at work. Can an employer prohibit the employee from bringing cannabis onto his property or areas used for work done for the employer? Examples of property: rented cars, rented space. But there is an exclusion. It's the person's own home, with an exception, an important exception. If the employee is doing work for the employer and showing signs of impairment during those work hours. Well, after hours. Can an employee use cannabis after hours? Yes, but not if he's using a company vehicle or is on company property. Then it's a no-no, or it can be held against them. Can an employee waive his rights? No, this cannot be done. It cannot be done as a condition of hire or of continued employment. Now, who is not covered under these rules? A volunteer, students, independent contractors, and those under 21 years of age. How about immigrants and non-citizens? Well, those people are covered. Now let's talk about reasonable accommodation for a person using medical marijuana. Who is a certified user? The criteria is, can an employee perform his or her job if that employee is provided with a reasonable accommodation? So the next question is, can the employer accommodate that person? Well, also it's advised that employers train supervisors about the medical uses of cannabis and about the impairments that allow its use. It's used for medical reasons. How does the police department fall into this? They are protected under the collective bargaining agreement. I do not know the particulars. Now I'm going to talk about something else, which are other considerations under New York state law that are not pertaining to employment, such as a residential building. Can a building or landlord ban the use or ownership of cannabis on their property, even if New York state law permits adults to use and own it? Well, think about smoking. Can a building or landlord prohibit the use of cigarettes on his property? The same thing that applies to cigarettes applies to cannabis. Now, Is there any requirement for a person to buy or use marijuana in New York State? That person must be 21 years of age or older. It cannot be younger. What persons are certified for medical use of marijuana in New York State? Any doctor. Let's think about how the person gets certified. Well, any doctor who can prescribe controlled substances and also takes a 2 to 4 hour course on medical marijuana can certify patients in New York State. He's going to require that there be certain qualifying medical conditions, such as AIDS, cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, anxiety, post-radiation pain, etc. There's a long list. I don't know the rest of the list offhand. Then, to be certified, once you have the certification by the doctor, the patient can register with the New York State Medical Cannabis Program. That person will receive a license, like a driver's license. They are considered certified users. Then, the patient is considered legally disabled under New York State human rights law. So it was interesting because it probably feeds into the use of marijuana in the residence. Now I asked myself, well, what kinds of dispensaries are there? There are medical dispensaries and there are non-medical dispensaries. There are some which are both medical and non-medical dispensaries. As I understand it, Walmart, and I've heard Costco fall into those categories. Can you or I or anyone else walk into a medical dispensary and purchase? No. You must bring proof of your residence, which would be New York State, and proof of your age, and a medical license from the New York State Medical Cannabis Program so that you can make a purchase at a medical dispensary. They accept cash because there's problems with banking and credit cards. However, these dispensaries usually have ATM machines so that you can withdraw cash. In New York State, do dispensaries have to be licensed? Can anyone just open a dispensary? Can anyone just open a business without getting licensing? Well, they have to be licensed. And today, most licenses are given to people in neighborhoods that were over-policed. Also, licenses are given to people who have first priority. Who have first priority? Well, they were people who were previously arrested for selling cannabis and for possession of cannabis. They get first priority for the license to open a business selling cannabis. What can an adult 21 years or older legally own? He or she can own 40 ounces of flour and 24 grams of oil. However, if you are found with more than that, that is considered to be a criminal offense. Today, I'm so fortunate to have Michael Flores with us. Michael is the president and CEO of Bretton Woods. He brings over 30 years of financial services experience with focuses on loan and deposit operations, commercial deposit, and cash management product strategies, alternative financial services, overdraft protection programs, payment systems, process improvement, and re-engineering through enabling technology. I'd say he's pretty well qualified. He began his career at Citizens and Southern National Bank, which is now called the Bank of America. From 1981 to 88, he was Senior Vice President for Bank Earnings International. He was responsible for national strategic planning. He has conducted research on controversial issues, written white papers, and testified before both Congress and the Senate regarding short-term and low-dollar consumer credit options, overdrafts, prepaid cards, and the impact of Dodd-Frank on community banks. But today he's with us to talk about the cannabis industry. Bring up the first slide, please, called State-Regulated Cannabis Programs.
It's an interesting map. It is changing almost daily. Right now there are 47 states that have some level of cannabis legalization, whether it's hemp, CBD, or low THC products, medical marijuana, for medicinal purposes, or recreational marijuana.
What is the legal status of cannabis use?
I'm sorry?
What is the legal status of cannabis use?
Federally, it's illegal. It's a Schedule I drug, narcotic. But at a state level, they have, particularly the western states that were early in this process, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, have realized it's like prohibition was for alcohol. People are going to find a way. So the idea is, let's structure it, let's make sure that there's quality, the product has good quality, it's tested, and then we collect taxes on it. And particularly with the downturn over the last several years, states have been struggling for revenue. And this was a way for them to tap another source of revenue. The other issue with legalization, not only the difference between state and federal, each state is unique. Their laws are unique, and then the regulations that are promulgated from those laws are very unique. So if a cannabis business operates in multiple states, or a bank offers services to a cannabis business that operates in multiple states, their compliance costs are extremely high. Now, the other thing to consider too is that, is it a criminal act? It's one thing to say I've legalized the product, it's another thing to say I've decriminalized the product.
The activity around it.
That's right. So even if it's legal, if I do something outside of regulation, if I buy the legal amount I'm allowed, depending on the state, but then sell it to another individual that's outside the scope, or sell it to somebody that's under 21 that's outside the scope of the regulations, then that's a criminal activity. And I can be prosecuted from a felony and have jail time. So some states have decriminalized it, which is to say, if I do something outside the scope of that regulation, then I'll be fined, like a traffic ticket. So not only you have a difference of state and federal, but you also have the criminalization issue, and one more, you've got municipalities. Local towns and cities can pass ordinances, even though the state says it's legal and you could sell through dispensaries, the town or the municipality can say, no, we don't want it in our town.
I would say furthermore, your apartment house could have its own rules.
Absolutely. It could say, if you're a non-smoking building, then that's going to apply to marijuana as well. So yeah, it's going to be a very complex endeavor to enforce the various regulations. I mean, the only winners in this are going to be the lawyers.
You're right. I mean, you gave an example just a few moments ago of a person selling something to someone else, but he himself could be flagged because he did some act which is considered prohibited.
That's right. So,
such as smoking maybe in the hallway.
Smoking in the hallway, or in New York State, in New York City primarily, any area that you cannot smoke tobacco, you cannot smoke marijuana. And so if you do smoke it right now, it could be a criminal offense. So it hasn't been decriminalized yet. And recreational marijuana won't be sold through dispensaries until right now, it's estimated as summer of 2023. So you have medical dispensaries, but not recreational dispensaries at this point.
Bring up the next slide, please, called U.S. marijuana market.
This is one estimate. It's a conservative estimate. Right now, we're considering the total legal market to be about $20 billion, approximately half and half between medical and recreational. In 2025, is estimating it to be $25 billion. Forbes came out with an article recently estimating up to $40 billion by 2025. Now, that represents what we think is probably half the market. The other half is going to be what I'll euphemistically call the unlicensed market.
Oh.
So
Competition.
That's right. If you look at what the finance people would call the total addressable market, you take those numbers and double them. And the growth trajectory is significant over the next 10 years. And that's why a lot of people are getting into the business. And we'll see here in a minute what segment of the business they're going to look at. But it's dynamic, it's growing, and as I said, right now it's split maybe 40% recreational, 60% medical. We'll see as more states legislate or legalize recreational, how that ratio changes. Is it going to stay approximately 50-50, or will recreational usage take off?
It'll be very interesting because also there'll be a market of lookalikes. In other words, packaging that looks like a noted brand but isn't.
Right, right. And it's interesting you say that packaging and branding. Ultimately, when it's decriminalized or legalized at a federal level, I think you're going to see big pharma, big tobacco, all get in to this space. And you're going to see a large consolidation. Right now you have a lot of mom and pop operations, whether they're growers or processors or testing labs, all the way through the dispensaries. I think what will happen ultimately is that they will sell out to the large operators, what we call MSOs, multi-state operators. And at that point, you're going to see a tremendous consolidation. But I think similar to the beer industry, if you go back to Prohibition times, and right after Prohibition, each town had their own brewery. And then you had consolidation with Coors and Budweiser and others gobbling up all these independent breweries. So you had, in essence, maybe 4 or 5 major breweries in the country. Now you see the proliferation of craft beers, craft breweries that are out there. I think cannabis is going to follow that same trajectory.
I'm curious. I know Canada is ahead of the United States.
Right.
Is the gobbling up happening up there, as far as you know?
You see some very big operators in Canada, and because they were more progressive in their laws, you did not see the initial proliferation of small businesses. So it's the large operators that are the primary factor in Canada.
Why is access to banking options so important to the cannabis businesses from the cannabis business point of view?
Right now, cannabis operators, cannabis businesses it's a cash business. And operating a total cash environment is risky, it's costly, and to pay their taxes, they have to hire armored car services to take cash to the taxing authorities. It's inefficient from their standpoint, it's inefficient from the taxing authority standpoint. So you have at the state level, initially credit unions, the state chartered credit unions, offering cannabis services, which is to say they can offer an operating account, a checking account, for them to make deposits of cash, because other payment methods aren't allowed. We'll talk about that in a moment. Then some state chartered community banks got involved. There are a handful of smaller regional banks that are doing this at a federal level, but it's primarily the state chartered organizations. And it's because of the safety issues for the employees and the customers of these operations. You're dealing with tens of thousands of dollars in cash on a daily basis, if not more, depending on the size of the operation. And so they're prime targets for theft.
I can just visualize right now people coming through the door with guns?
Oh, the security measures that are needed to operate these organizations is tremendous. Matter of fact, with this not-for-profit I'm working with, the Emerging Markets Coalition, we just wrote a standard for cash management, cash handling for cannabis businesses, all the way from the security measures taken, the routes that the Armored Car Service can take, the scheduling so you're not predictable in the scheduling of your transportation of cash. And the insurance coverage requirements that are needed. So it's quite an undertaking. And to think about this, not only the onerous nature of the security issues that are involved, but it's the licensing and taxation of the various states that at some point in some states is inhibiting the adoption of legal businesses. That is to say, the taxation is so high, some businesses have said our effective tax rate is 85%. And another reason for that, without getting too far into the weeds, is that IRS regulations state on an illegal enterprise, you cannot deduct your general and operating expenses. So you're being taxed on an adjusted gross income level, not a net income level. And so your tax rate is significantly higher.
Bring up the next slide, please. Primary hurdles working with marijuana-related businesses in the future.
As you see from that slide, we did a survey about a year ago of about 85 banks, different parts of the United States. And one asked them, are they currently banking cannabis businesses? Yes or no. And then based upon that response, when they filled out the rest of the survey, we aggregated the results. And for the banks that were not banking cannabis, you can see on that, number one concern is illegality. And then the compliance challenges. There's a metric out there right now that says for every 7 cannabis businesses a bank brings in, they need 1 full-time person, compliance person, to deal with it. And so it's very expensive from the bank's perspective. That's why the banks that do offer these services, they're charging $1,500, $2,000, up to $3,000 a month in service charges for these cannabis businesses.
Michael, I want to thank you so very much for coming on our show.
Sandra, thank you for
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Until next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Goodbye.